Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be discussing whether Chick-Fil-A hates gay people. Because you see, Chick-Fil-A is one of the most controversial fast food chains there is right now. And yeah, it's kind of strange to think that any fast food chain would be considered controversial, but hey, the year is 2019 and people have discovered that you could pretty much be upset about anything nowadays.
But not you, right, Lauren? You only get upset by important events, such as Kristen Stewart saying, quote, "I have fully been told if you just do yourself a favor and don't go out holding your girlfriend's hand in public, you might get a Marvel movie," Stewart explained. "I don't want to work with people like that," end quote. I mean, how dare she, right? It's totally unreasonable to get upset when you're told you shouldn't hold the hand of the person you love because it might hurt your career. Or that time you got publicly outraged over how celebrities dress. Or that time you were upset at a cartoon and how they portrayed Trump. Thanks for being the voice of reason in 2019.
Did you know that for the past 4 years, Chick-fil-A has been America's highest ranked fast food chain, and it's also currently the country's third largest fast food chain in terms of sales? Yup, it's quite the corporate behemoth. Yet despite all of that success, it's hard to mention Chick-fil-A online or in progressive circles without the whole gay situation coming up.
When you say that whole gay situation coming up, do you mean their long history of anti-LGBT sentiment and their continued support of anti-LGBT hate groups? Because that's a totally legitimate thing to criticize.
You see, the owners of Chick-fil-A are Christians. And I don't mean the secular, wishy-washy, I like Christmas, but that's pretty much it type of Christians that coastal elites may tolerate, for now, at least. I mean they are actual, practicing, Bible-believing Christians, the type of people the mainstream media might refer to as religious zealots, simply for, going to church.
No, Lauren. Going to church isn't the issue. In fact, there are many churches that support the LGBT community. The actual problem, as I've mentioned already, is their history of expressing anti-LGBT sentiments and their support of anti-LGBT groups. People aren't standing outside of Chick-fil-A protesting because the owners attend church. That's just you grossly misrepresenting their very valid reasons.
Fury over Chick-fil-A really first dates way back to 2012, when their CEO Dan Cathy said in an interview that he believes in the traditional biblical view of marriage. As the Washington Post reported back then, quote, Dan Cathy, president of the popular fast food chain Chick-fil-A, said on a radio show that we're inviting God's judgment on our nation when we shake our fists at him and say we know better than you as to what constitutes a marriage. And I pray God's mercy on our generation that has such a prideful, arrogant attitude that thinks we have the audacity to redefine what marriage is all about. The Post also notes that, quote, following backlash after those remarks, Cathy then told the Baptist Press that he is guilty as charged and is very supportive of the family, the biblical definition of the family.
So he's expressed his desire to prevent members of the LGBT community from enjoying the same rights and freedoms as heterosexual couples. And when called on it, he doubled down. In fact, he tripled down. According to the CBC, quote, when the U.S. Supreme Court chose to support same-sex marriage a year later, Cathy tweeted, "The founding fathers would be ashamed of our generation," end quote. Just to quickly rehash what we know so far, this has absolutely nothing to do with simply going to church. Despite your dishonest framing of the situation, Cathy wants to impose his personal, religiously fueled opinion on a minority. He wants to use the government to do so, and when the Supreme Court came out in favor of upholding the human rights and freedoms of the LGBT community, Cathy took to Twitter to publicly express his anger and paint the LGBT community as a literal threat to society. He has no problem expressing that sentiment and will use his personal power and wealth, supplied to him by people buying his chicken sandwiches, to make it happen. Alright. Go ahead. Please continue telling us how the multi-billionaire Christian is the real victim here.
What I think is important to keep in mind here is that Cathy made these statements in 2012, and the Supreme Court didn't rule to grant same-sex marriage nationwide in America until 2015, 3 years later. So whether you agree with Cathy or not, the idea that his statements were outside of mainstream consideration or acceptability, especially at the time, just doesn't make sense.
Looking at 2012 polls, support for same-sex marriage had fairly widespread acceptance, at least among Democrats and independent. The only group that seems to have largely considered same-sex marriage outside the realms of acceptability were the Republicans at the time. You know, people like Cathy. which is why he's still being criticized, and as far as I can tell, he's never recanted those statements. And although I can't know this for certain, I think it's a fairly safe bet to say that if Cathy had ultimate power, he'd roll back LGBT rights significantly.
And I know the Overton window has shifted a lot in the past 4 years, but the fact of the matter is that in 2012, not supporting same-sex marriage was the default position. And you don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, but that doesn't mean that everyone who thought that way was some crazy, insane anti-gay bigot, unless most people back then were crazy, insane anti-gay bigots.
I don't think they were necessarily crazy or insane, but that doesn't mean they weren't bigots. And it certainly doesn't mean that many of them still hold those same views today. And again, it was only the default position among Republicans and the religious, especially those who went to church often. It's almost as if a large fraction of those churches might have been propagating and spreading anti-LGBT sentiment or something, and passing those bad ideas on to their followers. Funny that. I'm sure it's a coincidence, though.
And even then, as NBC News reported in September of 2012, quote, Chick-Fil-A agreed to stop funding groups with anti-same-sex marriage stances. In an emailed statement to NBC, the company wrote, "Going forward, our intent is to leave the policy debate over same-sex marriage to the government and political arena." Even so, though, that statement aside, Cathy's past quotes plus the company's continued donations to Christian, or as activists like to call them, anti-LGBT organizations.
You mean how activists correctly label those organizations? But the point I really want to make here, and we'll get into the organizations Chick-Fil-A has funded soon, is that just because the individuals who run a corporation decide to stop airing their bigoted personal views publicly, doesn't mean they can't wield their considerable wealth and influence privately in an attempt to further their political goals. But we'll get to that soon. However, I also want to point out once again, Lauren's dishonest framing of the situation. The issue isn't that they're necessarily Christian organizations. It's that those particular organizations support things like discriminating against people based on their sexual orientation,
have led to numerous boycotts and protests against Chick-Fil-A. Not only that, though, but for the past 7 years, anytime anyone has mentioned the company, it's been followed with allegations of bigotry and hatred by progressives. And this extreme anti-Chick-Fil-A sentiment was on full display this past weekend when Chick-Fil-A opened up their first Canadian restaurant in Toronto, which was met with protests.
Oh no, they're being held accountable for their publicly stated views. The sky is falling. Those poor, poor victims. I think this brilliantly worded tweet by Shannon sums it up rather nicely. And that's really how this outrage game works. Some reactionary says something hateful about a minority or a vulnerable population. The targeted group voices their displeasure, and the reactionary points and says, "See? Look how hateful and intolerant they are. I'm the real victim in all this." It's a crappy game. It's a dishonest game. But the sad reality is that sometimes, maybe even quite often, the game is won by the reactionary.
Okay, so all of these LGBT activists are boycotting Chick-fil-A and they want the rest of us to as well. But the thing is, trying to get people to boycott something really only works if they like you, the activist, more than they like the thing you're trying to get them to boycott. For example, if The Rock told me to boycott CNN, I'd absolutely do it. I love The Rock, I don't care for CNN, so it's like, yes sir, Mr. Johnson, at your service, whatever you say. But if the KKK, for example, tried to get me to boycott the series The Office, that'd be a different story. I don't really care at all for the KKK, and I super love The Office, so it's kind of like, you can go to hell, KKK. I feel like that's kind of the situation these activists find themselves in with Chick-fil-A.
Your whole video is pretty ridiculous, but this part is on a whole other level. I mean, there's just so much wrong with it. Are you equating the LGBT activists with the KKK and doing it with a straight face? And why would you listen to The Rock just because you like him better than something else? Why wouldn't you examine why he's against CNN and try to form your own opinion? Or better yet, listen to CNN's side along with The Rock's so that you can make an informed decision. I know, that's crazy talk, right? And the people the activists are protesting against already view them in much the same way. Or worse than, you do CNN. I doubt they're reaching for likability points. It seems to me that they're targeting the rest of society and pointing out that people might want to rethink where they're spending their dollars. Not everyone watches the news or keeps up on the happenings at Chick-Fil-A, especially in a country where none of the restaurants have previously existed. In other words, they're trying to raise awareness. I would imagine that they're also trying to show people that there are real human beings that could be potentially affected by the propaganda that Chick-Fil-A helps fund. It's far easier to other and demonize people when you dehumanize them, and much harder when those people have a face and voice.
On the one hand, we have these LGBT activists who are known for kind of being moral busybodies right now, who go around telling people what to do and what not to do, and who try to ban things that people like. And it's actually gotten to the point now where even people who don't mind LGBT folks or who are LGBT themselves are getting sick and tired of these loudmouth activists. But on the other hand, we have Chick-fil-A, America's sweetheart, known for their delicious chicken sandwiches, who just sit there and don't tell anyone what to do, and who are known for their amazing customer service and for being a good employer. So it's like...
You're trying to tell me that the small minority who has had to scrape and claw their way toward being able to enjoy the same rights and freedoms most of us take for granted are the real moral busybodies? It's not the Christian billionaires who constantly whine about how the gay agenda is going to ruin society. It's not people like you who create videos like this one whining about how poor, misunderstood biblical Christian billionaire megacorporations are being attacked, when all they really want to do is sell delicious chicken. It's not the moral busybodies trying to deny same-sex marriage to a whole segment of the population because they think their holy book tells them to. It's not the Christians who blame natural disasters on the LGBT community, or the ones trying to torture the gay out of people with highly unethical conversion therapies. It's not the pastors who stoke hate towards a minority group from the pulpit and sometimes call for their deaths. Nope. It's the people who have done nothing besides march for their rights, and in this case stand outside a restaurant to try and raise awareness, and generally just tried to live their lives without having to worry about getting beaten, tortured, killed, or otherwise harmed by religiously fueled bigotry and intolerance, partially funded, both historically and presently, by corporations like Chick-Fil-A.
Does Chick-fil-A hate gay people? And does spending your money at Chick-fil-A mean that you're actually funding secret roving bands of Christian extremists who go around kidnapping LGBT youth in order to force them into conversion therapy? That's what I'm sure a lot of you might be wondering.
This is another thing that propagandists like to do. They like to say something like, "It's not like we're lining people up in the street and killing them for being gay, so it's fine. We don't hate the group we're actively trying to oppress with our money and influence." Newsflash, intolerance, hate, and bigotry can be realized in a spectrum. You can work towards limiting a group's rights without actively calling for their deaths. You can make their lives miserable without choking them to death in the streets. You might not be literally funding roving bands of Christian extremists who go around kidnapping people, but you could be helping to fund an organization that partially uses that money to fund groups actively working to discriminate against and limit the rights of the LGBT community.
Although Chick-fil-A did say it was getting out of the gay marriage debate, in 2016 a report was released that showed that year alone, the company had donated almost $2 million to organizations that Think Progress labeled as anti-LGBT.
In other words, they realized public opinion was not swinging in their direction, and decided to stop unapologetically shitting on the LGBT community and instead do it in the background by continuing to fund anti-LGBT Christian organizations.
As Think Progress wrote in 2018, quote, "A form which covers the year 2016 reveals that the Chick-fil-A Foundation, almost all of which is funded directly from corporate money, gave about $1.8 million to three nonprofits known for discriminatory activities: the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Paul Anderson Youth Home, and Salvation Army. This is actually a significant increase compared to its 2015 totals to the same groups." Now, this is where the conversation gets a little bit tricky.
Spoiler alert. It's not that tricky.
These organizations that Think Progress and these LGBT activists label as anti-LGBT, most people would just call Christian charities. And again, here we're talking about actual Bible-based Christianity, not the Pete Buttigieg brand of Christianity that just so happens to conveniently agree with everything left-wing progressivism says about social justice, and that also seems curiously secular.
Well, Lauren, you don't get to be the arbiter of what's biblical. There are a great many Christians who consider their Christianity to be biblical, but who also value the secular society we both live in.
The way these LGBT activists talk about these organizations, you would think they were conducting conversion therapy or funding people to just run around punching gay youth in the face. That's not what's happening, though. These are just your run-of-the-mill, although practicing and believing, Christian charities.
I was going to leave that last part out, but I wanted to show it because it's another example of Lauren playing the propaganda game. Instead of talking about the real harm these organizations cause, she's telling her audience it's not the worst thing they could imagine, so it's not that bad. Just good old Christian values. Nothing to see here, folks. I also want to apologize in advance. The next few clips of Lauren are a bit long, but I didn't want to take her out of context.
The Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the organization that the Chick-Fil-A Foundation gives the most money to, writes on its website that, quote, since 1954, FCA has been challenging coaches and athletes on the professional, college, high school, junior high, and youth levels to use the powerful platform of sport to reach every coach and every athlete with the transforming power of Jesus Christ. FCA focuses on serving local communities around the globe by engaging, equipping, and empowering coaches and athletes to unite, inspire, and change the world through the gospel. And based on their site, the way they do that is by organizing things like Bible studies, fellowship meetings, sports camps, and missions and service trips. Pretty standard Christian youth group stuff. But the reason why LGBT activists hate them so much is that on their website, under their statement of faith, they do say that they believe marriage to be between a man and a woman. Additionally, at one point, I'm not sure if this is still current because I couldn't find any up-to-date information about it, but the FCA did ask that all of its participants refrain from sexual activity outside of marriage, including homosexual activity. And for all of my secular friends who are watching this, those types of codes of conduct are very common among most religious institutions.
So here's the statement of faith on their website, which reads, quote, we believe God's design for sexual intimacy is to be expressed only within the context of marriage. God instituted marriage between one man and one woman as a foundation of the family and the basic structure of human society. For this reason, we believe that marriage is exclusively the union of one man and one woman, end quote. This seems pretty straightforward to me. They don't support same-sex marriage. They think there is something wrong with LGBT individuals. And if they were to follow their rules and be forced to live by their code of conduct, they'd never be able to marry or be intimate with the person they may love and want to share their time with. It's also funny that you couldn't find any up-to-date information on whether they asked homosexual individuals to refrain from sexual intercourse, because it took me about 5 seconds to find it. Quote, God desires his children to lead pure lives of holiness. The Bible is clear in teaching on sexual sin, including sex outside of marriage and homosexual acts. Neither heterosexual sex outside of marriage, nor any homosexual act constitute an alternative lifestyle acceptable to God, end quote. And like this article points out, this effectively means that LGBT student athletes and coaches would be banned from leadership positions. In fact, the same Think Progress article you cite in the video said the exact same thing. It's also not the same standard for heterosexuals as it is for members of the LGBT community, like you try to play it off to be. The statements very clearly say sex outside of marriage and any homosexual acts, which would include outside of marriage or in a lawful marriage. It's also irrelevant whether this same sort of sentiment is shared by many other organizations. If it is, that just means we have a lot more work to do.
For a time, I went to a Catholic high school and Mormon university, even though I'm neither Catholic nor Mormon, but still both schools had similar stipulations about student behavior. Now, you don't have to agree with or support those types of policies, but is the FCA, as a Christian charity, really bigoted or hateful for having them?
Yeah, they are. That's the point. And they're allowed to be hateful and bigoted, but people are also allowed to point it out. Being allowed to be that way doesn't mean you aren't that way.
Especially considering that they don't even condone straight sexual activity outside of marriage. It's not even like the FCA's goal is to go out there and spread hatred against LGBT identities. Their focus is about athletes and sports. They provide these programs for people to participate in voluntarily. They just ask that you follow some guidelines while doing so.
No. They actively target youth, and their guidelines enforce the idea that if you're part of the LGBT community, there's something wrong with you that needs fixing. They actively work towards limiting people's freedom, particularly if you're part of the LGBT community, and limit their participation on all levels in leadership roles. They're quite literally spreading hatred against LGBT identities.
I guess the question comes down to, would you want this privately funded charity to be completely defunded and unable to give these kids sports camp simply because they believe marriage to be between a man and a woman? Especially considering that was literally the law in your country up until 4 years ago.
Don't care about it being the law up until 4 years ago. I'd prefer they drop the anti-LGBT sentiment and quit targeting youth with their bad ideas. But if that isn't possible, yeah, I'd love it if they were defunded. and that money went to a charity that supports all people, including those in the LGBT community, it's really a no-brainer for me.
And similarly, the Paul Anderson Youth Home that the Chick-Fil-A Foundation also funds seems to be a Christian sort of halfway house for young men. According to their site, they offer spiritual and physical development, substance abuse treatment strategies, educational opportunities including high school classes and vocational training, as well as a transition program for the young men who stay with them. Like the FCA, the Paul Anderson Youth Home is not an organization that's dedicated to anti-LGBT interests. They're not going out there spreading LGBT hate. They're not trying to reverse the ruling on same-sex marriage. It's a halfway home for young men that happens to be run by Christians who, yeah, probably do disagree with all of these LGBT activists. But because of their difference of opinion, does that really mean these people should be unable to carry out any type of charity work?
Well, first off, they're not being prevented from performing charity work. Second, the Paul Anderson Youth Home reportedly teaches boys that same-sex marriage is a, quote, rage against Jesus Christ and his values, end quote. To be fair, according to People magazine, Chick-Fil-A stopped funding the LGBT-hating organization as of June 2017. Third, again, it has nothing to do with being run by Christians, but being run by LGBT-hating Christians who are using their religion to shame young, vulnerable boys.
And do you really hate the idea of what they're doing with these young men so much that you're willing to boycott Chick-fil-A just for daring to fund them?
Yes. Targeting vulnerable people is a vile thing to do.
And finally, to top it all off, the LGBT opposition to the Salvation Army? That really confuses me. What the LGBT activists don't like is that the Salvation Army is a Bible-based organization. However, on their website, they make it clear that their services and their charity is open to the LGBT community. In fact, when answering the question, does the Salvation Army serve the LGBTQ community? They answer yes. Any person who walks through our doors will receive assistance based on their need and our capacity to help. Our mission is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and meet human need in his name without discrimination. And they also state that they don't consider sexual orientation or gender identity in hiring practices, and that they do provide benefits to same-sex spouses of employees. So essentially, these activists must be against the Salvation Army not for being anti-LGBT, because I don't think you can call them that at all, but for being not pro-LGBT enough, because I think those two things are the same in their minds.
Except at the time of that writing, quote, the Salvation Army has a long record of opposing legal protections for LGBTQ Americans, and at the time of the donation had a written policy of merely complying with local relevant employment laws. The organization's website has since changed to indicate a national policy of non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, end quote. In other words, what you're reading now didn't apply when the donation was made. You also ignored the Salvation Army's long history of discrimination towards the LGBT community, which has left deep scars, ones that the Salvation Army acknowledges. On the one hand, you have stories about the Salvation Army trying to reverse course by opening a space in Canada for homeless LGBT people, while you have others alleging that they refuse treatment to transgender patients. I'm not part of the LGBT community, but I can easily understand their reluctance to trust an organization such as the Salvation Army.
As Chick-fil-A has seen, it's just not enough to say that you're going to treat LGBT people like everyone else and that you'd be happy to serve them. No, as long as you still call yourself Christian and unless you jump on board with the whole LGBT agenda, they're gonna call you bigoted and they're gonna call you a homophobe.
Because it's easy to say you stand for something, but actions speak louder than words. The actions of these organizations clearly point toward discriminatory, bigoted behavior and attitudes. So yeah, it's not enough to just say something. Surprise, surprise, you actually have to live up to the words with your actions. Welcome to reality, Lauren.
So ultimately, is Chick-fil-A anti-gay, and if you spend money there, are you funding anti-gay organizations? The answer is no.
The answer is yes. When you buy a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A, you're potentially helping to fund anti-LGBT organizations. You might be fine with that. You might rationalize it away. But that's the reality of the situation, and no amount of spin from people like Lauren here can change that fact. Chick-fil-A has in the past and present donated money given to them by customers to anti-LGBT organizations. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, thanks for watching. Take care and cheers.
You take me home, invite me in. The lights go down.